Welcome to An Actor's Arc. I'm Sean Douglas, and this season I talk with 7 actors in the early leg of their artistic journeys, how they got started, and how they have found their footing. In this episode, I welcome Behzad Dabu. Hello, Behzad Dabu. Welcome to An Actor's Arc. Happy to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You bet. As with everyone who's on this show, I start by just asking them, what was the first impulse or the first moment or the first inclination that you had to be an actor? Do you remember?
I do, actually. I grew up in a small community in Syracuse, New York, upstate New York. Mm-hmm. And our ethnic background is something called Zoroastrians. We're a really small religion. We're the first monotheistic religion. And I didn't grow up super religious or anything, but for some reason in this small upstate New York town, they were about 10 families, 10 Zoroastrian families. And so we would get together, all their kids would get together. It ended up being about 40 or 50 people that I grew up around. We would see on holidays or occasions and things like that. Today, actually, literally today, as we're recording this, happens to be Zoroastrian New Year. So it's a big day for us.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. But, we would meet, and whenever they would meet, I would have this desire to do a performance of some sort. There would be an Indian movie on in the background, and I would copy the dancers in a make fun of them way. Or I remember one time, it was 92 actually, and the election had just happened. The 92 election had just happened. And I remember putting on this red, white, and blue hat. And I had a Gore, a Gore Clinton sign, I think. And I did a little performance. So I was just a kid. I had no idea what I was doing, but I liked making the adults laugh.
Yeah.
Or I liked making the adults clap. And I think I remember, they would clap for whatever little thing I did, but I remember liking that.
Yes, I did the robot. I was imitating Shields and Yarnell, which was a mime variety show, a husband and wife mime.
Oh, wow. I don't know that. I'm going to look that up.
Okay, so here you are as this young boy in a funny hat. And
yes.
How did that translate into something that looked like acting as opposed to showing off?
Yeah, exactly. So my mom put me in little classes. So there was something called the Royal Fairy Tale Theater, which would do sort of very young 30-minute versions of Shakespeare plays or fairy tales, Aesop's fables, things like that. So I remember I played King Alonso in The Tempest, but the 6-year-old version of The Tempest, right? I remember and all of our costumes were whatever you could pull from home. And there was this little tiny stage in a park in upstate New York where I grew up, where we would meet. And I keep saying tiny because just last year I went home to visit my parents and we were driving and I said, let me pull over. I want to go see if that stage is still there. Yes. And I went, and this stage was still there, covered in bushes. It had beer bottles, and people had carved into it and stuff. I mean, it is completely deserted, but it felt so small to me now. And I remember thinking it didn't feel that small when I was a kid, but oh my God, it felt the size of a bed almost. It was so small, but yeah, so my mom put me in classes. And then I started doing the school plays. And from there, I remember in 7th grade, I played Fagin and Oliver. And then in 8th grade, I played Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. And then started playing these great roles. And then I started doing a lot of things I wouldn't do now, understanding as far as ethnicity and race and things like that. But at the time and at the age I was, no one had talked to me about any of that. So I ended up doing West Side Story and The King and I, and doing all these plays, Lend Me a Tenor and Noises Off, and doing all these plays, which I realized I was good in middle school, high school, but I felt I wasn't being challenged, not because they weren't great, but just because even the people who were directing those things were really just teachers volunteering their time
Sure.
at our school. And I didn't go to one of those like big arts high schools or anything like that. You know, we grew up very lower middle class in this lower middle class suburb of this kind of dead city. We didn't have access to like the huge theaters and things like that, or like the big art schools. It wasn't like growing up in Chicago where you could go to the Goodman or go to Steppenwolf and see. It wasn't like that.
Mhm.
And so I started doing community theater in Syracuse. And that's when I really got a chance to learn from people who knew a little bit more, right? People who maybe had studied theater or maybe had directed something years ago in New York or something like that, right? And as I started learning a little bit more, I took it upon myself to really dive in. So I started taking trips down to New York City and seeing Broadway shows and started really researching theater programs and started really learning. As we were talking about earlier, I started watching Inside the Actors Studio, like box set. That's what I asked for Christmas was the box set of Inside the Actors Studio, which I got, and I watched all of it. And I kind of like researched on my own and started like reading plays at the library and things like that. He's really dove into this thing.
So it sounds like there was a real entrepreneurial, if that's the right word, or I mean, you were leading yourself through this journey, even at a young age.
Yeah, I kind of always said that my whole life. Like when I get a passion for something, I get borderline obsessive on it. I want to learn everything about it. That stays with me to this day. I learn about something and I'm like, well, let me learn more about it. Next thing you know, I'm up at 4 a.m. learning about this thing. Yeah, I really did that. I really did that with acting and specifically like which theater program I wanted to go to. And
what did you choose and what were your criteria for choosing?
So I ended up going to Columbia College Chicago, which I loved. I thought it was a great choice at the time. I know the program is very different now, but at the time, I kind of hit this sweet spot of the college. The college was growing rapidly. It became the largest art school in the nation at one point. Sheldon Patinkin was still running the theater department. He was the chair. There was a magical sweet spot of the college for about maybe 8 years, where it had grown to a national landscape where over 50% of the students were from out of state. It had changed from the previous generation, which was mostly an in-state school for CPS art students to go to. But there was this like kind of like this national landscape had happened. It had just started an international push. So they were getting international students from all over the country or from all over the world. So there was this awesome thing that was happening, but also it still had the like wild west feel of like, well, we're an art school, we don't do it like Northwestern does, we don't do it like DePaul does, we don't do it like the other school does, we kind of do whatever here kind of vibe. So I had this sort of like blend of both, and I only know this because I continued to stand as an employee of the college afterwards, but then everything changed. Sheldon died, new transitions at the school tried to become more traditional like other institutions, budgets went down, and now I think the school has shifted again. But I was really fortunate to have this sweet spot. I really loved my college experience at Columbia.
So what was one of the fascinating experiences or one of the big growth experiences that you had while you were at Columbia?
I chose Columbia because they were a faculty of working professionals. And so I got to work with these amazing, amazing teachers. And I teach acting now. And I every day, I mean, like even last night in class, I was using things I learned from teachers at Columbia, right? So teachers like Jeff Ginsburg and Tom Mula and Kathleen Perkins, and just like amazing teachers, Sheldon Patinkin, Brian Shaw, these amazing teachers that I still use things they taught me, right? And I got to play amazing roles. And what was great at Columbia is they would challenge me. They knew the role that I would normally get cast as in a professional world. And then they challenged me and they gave me something different. I remember this, like, if anyone knows me as an actor and you were doing Romeo and Juliet, as an actor, my wheelhouse is Mercutio or Tybalt. Like that's where I belong. That's the type of character-y thing I can do, Mercutio, Tybalt. And so I'm auditioning for Romeo and Juliet and they cast me as Romeo. And even I was like, well, I'm not like the romantic lead guy. Like that's not me. Like, I'm like the character over on the side. That's what I do. And I remember Sheldon and Tom being like, for sure. That's what you would audition for in professionally. But like,
Mm.
let's like expand what you can do here and like, let's see what happens. And they actually, the guy who played Mercutio was more of a Romeo. You know, they did that. And I thought that was great that they did that. Like it allowed me to expand and allowed me to like have the confidence to stretch myself. It's funny too. I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. Like being in upstate New York, you're only a couple hours away from New York City, and all these community theater actors I knew that were studying, that were going to go on and study theater. For everybody, it was like New York, New York, New York, New York, New York, New York. Got to go to New York, and it was all the New York schools. But for me, I don't really sing. I wasn't a musical theater guy, and when we did the visits, we did the visits like NYU and Emerson and Boston and all these things. But when I went to Chicago, I saw 2 plays that weekend. And the 2 plays changed my life. They really did. So the first play was The Pain and the Itch at Steppenwolf, a Bruce Norris play. I was 17, maybe 18, 17 probably. And I had never seen such a provocative play. I had never seen budget put into a play. Like in my mind at 17 years old, with my experience, budget goes into musicals and plays. Everyone wears black in a black box in 80 seats. So to go into the Steppenwolf's main stage and see this gorgeous set and like rotating things and lights and like for a play was like, and then the next day I saw, Frankie and Johnny and the Claire de Lune with Yasin Payankov and Laurie Metcalf, I believe. And again, I was like, what is this? This is what I want to do. And I think I took a tour, and the tour guide said something like, oh yeah, Chicago, like we do it like this. Like we do gritty. We do the plays. Like we put money into that. Like we don't do that New York thing. And as a 17-year-old, that was enough. I was like, screw New York. I'm going to Chicago where they do it. I had never done a play where, you could swear and talk about things like that. And it was just really like my aesthetic. And it made me feel like that's where I want to go. And there was a little bit of like, yeah, my other friends are going to New York. I want to go to Chicago. I want to do it different,
And so did you stay in Chicago after you finished?
I did. So I finished at Columbia in 2008. And immediately the graduating class 2008 started a theater company called Jackalope Theater. Great theater company. They still exist in the Edgewater neighborhood. I think they're in the Big Armory. They are now a great, award-winning theater that has a great reputation. But that wasn't the case in 2008 when we graduated, right? When we graduated, we were performing. Oh my God, I have these amazing memories of, we had rented the downstairs of like a space, of like an artist space, and upstairs was practice rooms, musician practice rooms. But we had rented it for 2 hours, and our play was 2 hours. So if we didn't finish at the 2-hour mark, the final 5 minutes of your play would just be hearing like from upstairs, or like the drummer would start. But then my first professional production was, I did The History Boys, the Chicago premiere at Timeline Theater. Which was a big deal for me, my career, and all 8 boys actually who did The History Boys. We extended and extended and extended and extended with one of your Northwestern alum, Alex Weissman was in that with me. 3 Columbia kids, some DePaul kids, and it was Timeline's first equity production. And we sold out. We just kept doing it and doing it and doing it, and it was a lesson for me in that. I'd never done a show more than 2 weekends, and so to do a show from April to December, 6-7 times a week. And I remember, I think I was making $125 a week. And I think I remember being thrilled. Like, I remember being thrilled. Like, I'm getting paid for this. Someone is paying me to act, and the $125 had like nothing to do with it. It was like someone's paying me to act. And it was so exciting. And from there, I kind of was introduced to the city at large. So from that production is what started getting me auditions at other places, from Victory Gardens to Goodman. I ended up becoming a company member at Timeline from that years later. So yeah, that kind of like led me to my Chicago theater journey, where I stayed for 11 years.
Aside from that show being important to you and exciting for the reasons you mentioned, was it exciting to work with those colleagues?
Yeah. I mean, one of them is one of my best friends to this day. In fact, I officiated his wedding. And we met on that show. Nick Bowling was the director of that. And the show can feel very stuffy because it's very academic and it talks about high level concepts. It's British in its core, right? So to relate to not only American audiences, but Chicago audiences, we needed to have some like fun and energy. And so he really stressed ensemble. He really stressed ensemble in a way that we could have fun. He felt like if the actors were having fun, the audience would be having fun. And we were right there. I mean, we were like, I could hold my hand out, not just to touch the front row, like the second row, the front row was like in our laps. So, that was so fun, but it fed us off stage. We were inseparable. I mean, every night after the show, we would do a 3-hour show, 2 show days. And, we were 21 years old. So then we would go and drink beers and do karaoke all night. Like we were those guys. And it was like, and then the next morning we felt great, and we could do it. And we were eating. I was joking with Will Allen, the other actor I was just talking about. I was like, do you remember we would like do a show and then we would have a 1-hour break and we would go like stuff our faces with Mountain Dew and Taco Bell and then like go do a second show. And like now the thought of that is like, well, I'd have to call out. There's no way I can do a second show like that. It's not cliche to say for some of those boys, like lifelong friendships. And even the ones that I'm not like daily in touch with, like I am with Will, I genuinely believe that if any one of those boys reached out to me today, I'd pick up the phone in a heartbeat for whatever they needed.
That's a real gift.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
So doors began to open up for you in Chicago?
Yeah, doors began to open up for me. I ended up doing like the Christmas Carol right after that at the Goodman. And I started getting some really great auditions. I did some plays I'm very proud of, some plays I'm not so proud of, but important plays in my growth where I did Blood and Gifts at Timeline and got to play a really great role. That led to me becoming an artistic associate at Timeline. But then, and this is where my career sort of trajectory changed a little bit, I started to work on new plays and I started to really enjoy working on new plays more than anything else. So I got to work on the original production of Disgraced at American Theater Company, which ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize and nominated for a Tony. Won the Pulitzer Prize for drama in 2013, I believe, maybe 2014. So I worked on that in 2011 and 2012 in the first production. Wow. Yeah. And then I also worked with Lauren Yee on her new work, Samsara, which was one of maybe my favorite role I've ever played, ever. I had so much fun on stage. I played a fetus, like a fetus, in this beautiful play. Very magical realism, but it was a genius fetus, a fetus who had memorized the encyclopedia. So it was a really great role, so much fun. And originating roles started to get really exciting for me. I loved getting new pages during the preview process. I loved being able to have like impact into the writing on the page. Like I love being able to be like, hey, this is hard for me to say, but I think you mean this. Is it okay if I say this? And the next day, like that's in the script. And I was like, that's my words in the script. That's pretty cool. Like I started to really like that. So then in Chicago, I really engaged in doing like the new play festivals, the Ignition Fest at VG. And anytime a new playwright was sort of we were doing like an internal read at Timeline with a new playwright, I always was like volunteering to even read stage directions if there was no part for me, you know. I just really started to get into that. And that ended up being really informative into my career, because 10 years later, that led me to start writing.
Okay, before we get there.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, what was different or exciting about creating a role that had never been created before?
I don't know if this is going to be a cliche answer, because I know people say this all the time, but there really just weren't roles for people who look like me in traditional theater. And so it really just felt like the only roles that really match me up are roles that are being created. You know, Ayad Akhtar, who wrote Disgraced, it ended up being the most produced play in America for 2 years in a row, non-Shakespeare. So,
wow.
And there's 2 great roles for brown men in that play. And so I'm making this number up, but let's just assume that's like 20 productions. I think it's around there, 20 productions a year. So that's 40 theaters, 2 actors. That's 80 brown actors that got to play a role I promise you they've never gotten to play before. They got to wear a $700 suit and be wealthy and be a successful New York lawyer and have a beautiful wife and not have any talk about terrorism and not be like a barefoot Afghan warlord. You know what I mean? And to do that and be brown. See, sometimes whenever I got to wear a suit, I was hiding. I was playing Mark. I was playing a prince. I was in a Shakespeare production. I was playing Romeo. Yeah, when I was playing Romeo, but like I was never playing Amir or, you know, Hussein, right?
Yes.
And so that was what was really great. So I remember one time in an interview 15 years ago, someone said, like, what's your dream role? And I said, my dream role hasn't been written yet. I'm going to play my dream role in 10 years when someone writes it. Like someone's going to write a play in 2027 that I'm going to perform in 2028. And that's my dream role. Like, I can't wait. I really love that. And I love the idea that, and I truly believe this has happened, but I love the idea that in 2050 at Northwestern University, the students are going to be studying Disgraced as like it's a Pulitzer Prize winning play that encapsulates the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 in America. It is a play about the American dream and what it means to be brown in America. And if you're a student in 2050 and you wanted to understand what theater was like in the 2010 to 2015 era, you have to study that play. And I love that. I love that, like the work we did in a fire station in Irving Park in Lincoln is going to be studied in 50 years all over the country. I think that's just amazing.
Is there any challenge in trying to create something that's never been created before? Coming from someone whose career was mainly doing classical work and British work that had been done 10, 20, 30, 90 years ago, I always had some kind of idea, whether it was from film or whether it was from reading about other famous actors who had done these roles. I had information that was already stirring in my head. And with a new play, you don't have that luxury, but you have other possibilities, I guess.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is like, if you haven't seen something done before, there's a lot of doubt on whether it can be done. So there was a playwright who I was working on a new play with, very successful playwright. And at the very end of the play, there was a white character in the play that he wanted to have like the last line. And I remember asking a question, I'm like, it's not even like that important of a character. Like, why are we doing that? Like, why can't we just end it with these 2 people of color characters? And he was like, I don't think the audience will care if we end a play with 2 people of color on stage. Like, I don't think that was his real concern. He really felt like he needed to bring the white character in to sort of like wrap it up for the majority white audience. And I remember not just me, but the director, everybody challenged him and was like, I think we should trust ourselves and give the benefit to the audience a little bit that we can, and maybe where we've come in this moment. And we ended up trusting ourselves, and we did end the play. He did end the play the way he wanted to, right? With these two brown characters. And it did come across well, but I don't think that means his doubt was unfounded. I think his doubt was absolutely founded and grounded in something real of like, well, I've never seen that happen before.
Right.
You know, he'd never seen it done before. So I think there's that the thing. It's like, if it hasn't been done before, you wonder if you can do it, you know? And I feel like that with TV. It's like, when I grew up, the only brown character on television was Apu on The Simpsons, voiced by a white guy. And it's literally a cartoon. And when I say that to people, people are like, no, there's got to be something else. And I always respond and say, tell me, what was it? What was the lead character on television the entire 90s? And I've yet to get a response. It doesn't exist. And so there is a sense of like, can you do this if you've never seen anyone do it? But it is also freeing to be like, there's no rules here. We're creating, so we can create whatever we want.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talking about being able to give voice to that and the collaborative nature of that with this, in this particular production. And was that something you gained confidence in doing over the course of growing as an actor over time, in terms of contributing in that way? Or is that something you always had?
No, I was definitely, I definitely held back at first more, but it's kind of like a reading the room situation of like, am I allowed to do this, to say this now? But I have strong opinions, and I have what I think are good opinions because they're my opinions. So I think they're good. And I think, you know what I think about that for people who are thinking like, sometimes I want to say something and I don't want to say anything. What I've learned over the years is like, when you give an opinion, you're just expressing your interest in this thing that you're giving an opinion on. You're not actually asking what their interest is in accepting it. I'm gonna give you an example. Like if I say, I'm interested in this character not dying at the end, I'm not actually asking if they're interested in the character dying at the end or not. See, that's when you've crossed the line sometimes. If I say, do you think the character should die at the end? See, now I'm like asking them for their opinion. But if you share an interest, I'm really interested in seeing what happens if this character doesn't die at the end. It's up to them whether they want to take it or not. And if you're open to either response, then everything is really collaborative and easy, because it's like, I'm actually just sharing my interest in the thing. If you say, no, that's dumb. Okay, great. That's dumb. If you say, no, that's not dumb. Great. Let's talk about it. But the tricky part happens when you cross the territory into saying this should happen. This is why it shouldn't happen. See, now you're putting it on their interest. And I have taken this into casting, where if I'm interested in a role, I have no problem telling the creators, I'm interested in this role. I'm not asking you if you're interested in me. That's your decision. If you're interested in me, it's up to you. If you want to call me in, that's up to you. If you want to offer it, that's up to you. I'm telling you that I'm interested in playing this role. I'm just expressing my interest.
That's really powerful, I think, especially for young actors to hear.
It's a tricky line, because sometimes people will say, hey, can I get an audition? It's like, well, now you're encroaching in their decision-making. But hey, I would love an audition. Just letting you know I would love one. Not asking for one, you know? So I think it's a powerful distinction, but it is a distinction because it's leaving the ball in the court of the people whose court it is.
Behzad, how do you think your acting has grown and changed over the last 10 years? What have you gotten better at? What have you changed in the way you think about acting? And now you're teaching acting, so I know that you must be thinking about acting.
Wow, that's a good question, because I've changed modalities over the last 10 years, right? From primarily stage to primarily television. So since the modality has changed, my approach has sort of changed. I feel like on stage, people often talk about like, oh, you have to be bigger on stage and smaller on camera. And I really don't react to that well, because there's nothing small about what Viola Davis does on camera. There's nothing small about it. It's grand, actually, but it's incredibly believable and grounded, but it's not like smaller. The way I would say it is like, I always thought about acting maybe 10 years ago as I'm stripping off myself and like stepping into a character, right? I'm metaphorically and visually, if you can imagine, like literally stepping into the costume, which is the skin of the character. And now I think of it kind of a reverse where no, I'm taking that character and putting it on me. I don't have to remove myself and step into a character. I actually take the character's skin and like paste it on me so that there's more of my truth in the character. So instead of if I'm playing the role of Hamlet, it's not what does Hamlet do in this situation? It's what does Behzad do if Behzad was the Prince of Denmark?
Mm-hmm.
And my father was killed and now I'm seeing his ghost. How does Behzad react to that? See, but when I do that, I find that there's more truth to those moments because I have brought it to me rather than, well, I'm the Prince of Denmark 600 years ago. It's like, I don't know that. So now I'm playing a thing versus like, but if I'm the Prince of Denmark and my dad dies and now I'm seeing his ghost, wow. Like now I can find some truth. It's a slight difference, but it's kind of huge for me.
Well, recently I've been thinking about the suspension of disbelief for the audience, right? That they don't actually believe what's on stage, but they suspend their belief in order to go for the ride of the story. And a big part of that, and I do share this with my students, is they believe who you say you are
100%.
when you walk on stage. And so there's a whole lot of work that I think we sometimes feel we have to do.
Yes.
As we come on as actors that we don't have to do because the audience is doing it for us.
I love this. So Kimberly Senior, who you may all be familiar with, especially in Northwestern, I know she's done a lot in Evanston and all of that. So Kimberly Senior, who I've worked with many times, has this thing, and I don't know if it's hers or she got it from somewhere else, but she told it to me. So in my mind, it's hers. She talks about the bones versus the bias. And the bones are the bones. They're the facts. Those are what's true. And the bias is how you feel about it. And you don't have to play the bones because we believe it. So just like you said, you know, if I walk on stage and I say to the actress on stage, hey, sis, how's mom doing? Then the audience goes, they're siblings. I don't have to play it. I don't have to like, oh, hey, sis. And like, oh, you know, I don't have to play it. I go, hey, sis, how's mom doing? And then the audience goes, okay, great. They're brother and sister. Now the audience knows that we're actors who probably aren't related, that might even be different races or whatever. It's like, that doesn't matter. They have suspended their disbelief. We all turned our phones off. We're watching the thing for 2 hours. We're facing the same direction in a dark room. And we're saying they're brother and sister. Now, the only thing I have to play is the bias. How do I feel about my sister? So you play the bias, but not the bones. The same thing with alcohol. If this is whiskey and I come in here and take my fourth thing of whiskey and say, another bartender, and the bartender says, are you sure you've had enough? The bones are, I'm drunk. So I don't have to play it. The audience knows it because that's the bones. He's had 4 whiskeys.
So in these 10 years of being a working actor in Chicago, is that right?
Yeah.
I can hear sort of embedded in much of what you've been talking about today that something else was going on with you around representation and activism and that being important to you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that writing has become important to you, which I didn't know, which I want to learn more about.
Yeah.
And what was, because this is an actor's arc, but for many actors, right? People who start out as actors, that is a creative door to many pathways in the arts and beyond the arts. So what began to happen to you?
Well, in Chicago, I was a founding member of a company that still exists, organization that still exists called the Chicago Inclusion Project. And I'm still a board member. Now that I'm in LA, I'm not as actively involved, but I'm still on the board. That's M. Joy Gavino and Alana Elise and Stephanie Diaz, some really great people, others. But that was a organization that seeked to help level the playing field for women, people of color, LGBTQ communities, and people with disabilities throughout the arts, music, dance scene in Chicago. And so that wasn't an organization that was down to tear down theater companies who were doing it wrong, but rather help theater companies that wanted to do it right. And so I remember examples of, we did a reading of William Saroyan's Time of Your Life. That's the play with like 20 people at a bar, I think. So
Yes,
we did a reading of that, but with like 20 great actors. So doing that reading sort of to introduce the people to say, look, here are a bunch of actors who can do roles outside of what we normally get cast as or seen as. And so that was something great. And I've always kind of had that representation thing because of what we talked about earlier, because I didn't see myself growing up. And I just think that it's important to do that. And I always said I would never write because I'm not a writer, I'm an actor. And I almost even got offended at this thing I kept hearing. It was like, well, you got to create stuff for yourself. And I remember being like, well, that's unfair. I'm an actor. Other people get to be actors. How come like we have to create shit for ourselves? So we have to be actor, writer, producer, extraordinaire, director. I have to create for myself, but other people just get to be actors. I always like kind of hated that. But you know, this new play, new work, developing, doing constant readings of new plays and developing new plays. I don't know what it was, but actually I do know what it was. I do remember the thing that shifted for me. I'm going to tell the story. Can I tell the story?
Please.
So I was 28 years old at this time. So this is about, more than 5, less than 10 years ago. And I went home and I noticed that some of the things my mom and dad were always telling me about how they grew up and about their parents, meaning my grandparents, wasn't like quite adding up. As I got older, I was still communicating with my grandparents on WhatsApp and communicating with them on Facebook. And the things they were saying versus what my parents had told me about them my entire life, they were starting to be like things. So I finally was like, Mom and Dad, like, what's going on? Because you told me this, but they're saying this, and like, what's happening? And I'm 28 years old, and my parents sit me down and they're like, do you want to know the truth? And I was like, I do. And my mom and dad tell me the true story of how they emigrated from India and got to this country. It is filled with deceit and shock and awe and like, this story is just not what I was told for 28 years. Made me see my parents in a totally different light. I always thought they were like soft, but now I saw them as like warriors of what they like went through. And so the emotions going through me were like, first of all, I'm so sorry that happened, but then almost like, I'm so sorry I didn't know, but also you didn't tell me. Why didn't you tell me? And like all this kinds of thing. And I was like, I need to write this. So that story that they told me became the spark for, at once was a movie, which is now a pilot for a television show, for my story. So I'm currently writing a pilot called Rite of Passage with a Chicago playwright, national playwright called Marcus Gardley. And since I needed help from a real writer, someone who's done it before. So Marcus and I are writing it, and I'm thrilled about it. But that's what kind of was like, that was the thing that was like, when they told me the story, I was like, well, this story is good. This is a good story. And I need to tell it. So, yeah.
Well, what's exciting about that is like, what are 80% of the stories in the theater about? Family.
Yes.
Behzad, you said, just as we were talking before we started the formal part of the conversation today, that Los Angeles as a town, as an industry town, was tough.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how you are. Well, what are you doing first? Are you still pursuing acting? Still pursuing writing?
I'm absolutely still acting. I audition a lot. I'm actively in the conversations, in the circles for all these projects that are happening, really exciting projects. I am working on developing this story we just mentioned with Marcus Gardley. So I'm actively pitching that and trying to get representation for that and doing a lot of those things, which is a lot of work. But I am also teaching and coaching a lot. So I'm the onset coach for Showtime's The Shy. So I'm the onset acting coach for that. I am the director of the acting track for Lena Waithe's Hillman Grad Mentorship Lab. Some connection to Evanston. Lena Waithe spent some time in Evanston as a child, and she has this amazing production company called Hillman Grad. So I run the acting track of her program. And then finally, I teach a scene study here on Thursday nights, which I love. It's a really awesome kind of LA lacks a lot of like get in there, theater, gritty scene study. So I teach one of those. So I love all those three things, but I am actively pursuing acting roles. I've done a lot of television work here, found some success in television shows, How to Get Away with Murder and The Shy and The Good Place and All Rise. And
what would
like
be the
that.
brass ring for you as an actor out there? What would you like to have happen for yourself?
I would love to just play a sort of great, nuanced, complex role on a great TV show with a cast that feels like family. I like to have good writing with a great cast and shoot in LA. I mean, that feels like the dream, you know? I love the idea of playing a role that's either really strong on the outside with an inner vulnerability or a really vulnerable role with like an inner strength. I love that sort of thing, right? Like that inner fire on a weak character or that inner fear in a strong character excites me. I would love to do something like that on television with a great cast. That would be great. I would love that opportunity.
And since you're out there, I'm guessing that auditioning for the theater is not as common for you, if it exists at all.
It's not that common. I have done like at least one play a year for a while. So I came back to Chicago and did the live streamed production of I Hate It Here at the Goodman during the pandemic last year. Right before the pandemic, I did a show at La Jolla Playhouse with Chicago playwright and director Lillian Brown and Ike Holter. So that was great at La Jolla Playhouse. And I am auditioning for a show at the Geffen coming up later this year, but it is far less. It used to be several auditions a week for the theater in Chicago, and now it's one or two a year.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you're interested in sharing about your journey?
I've learned, I'm not old or anything like that, but I've learned as I've gotten older that everything I kind of told myself that I wasn't going to do, I've ended up doing. Like, and I guess what I'm saying is I sort of wish I didn't. I wouldn't necessarily call it a regret, but I wish I didn't like block myself off from things for so many years. Like I said, I will never write. I'm not a writer. I don't write. No, I'm writing. I said, I'm never going to go to LA and do television work. I'm a theater actor. I'm going to stay on the stage while I live in LA and I do television work. I don't want to become a teacher while I teach. And it's like, we block ourselves off because we have these like, we think that how we feel at the age we are at now is how we're going to feel at the age we're going to be in the future. And I have just found that every time I've done that, I've been wrong. I've just been wrong. Like at 31, I'm like, I should write. At 21, I was like, I'm never going to write, you know, but that's just how I felt at 21. And so I encourage younger or newer early career actors to not block themselves to so many pathways, especially in the world we live in now. Like there's so many different ways to make content and where the world is. I see futures of virtual reality and Web3 and metaverse content. There's so much out there that like is on the current 20s generation, the current people in their 20s to figure out. And it's exciting rather than being like, oh, I'm never going to do that. Like, well, maybe you might.
3 questions we'll end this with.
Sure.
One actor you really admire and a quick reason why.
Viola Davis is the answer. Viola Davis seems to have like found success on her terms. Viola Davis has played all sorts of different roles. I mean, just like everything under the sun, has never been typecast. Well, not should never been, but is currently not typecast in anything. Has done everything, and has also like done it with grace and humility and not changed as a human from what we can tell and see. So I would say Viola Davis is the answer to that.
One thing that delights you about being on the stage or being in front of the camera?
Oh man, that's good. I love being on stage. There's like, it's only happened to me a few times on stage. Like I've probably done thousands of performances, right? Not thousands of plays, but thousands of performances. And only a few times has this thing where you get in like a creative state, Stanislavski said, or creative flow, like where you sort of just, it's like you kind of come out and you feel like you're improvising within the lines that you're saying. You're saying the lines in the script, you're doing the blocking that you're doing, but it feels like it's the first time. It really, like, you get there, you get lost in it. And I've done entire productions where I didn't get there the whole run. I did a great job, nailed it, but didn't get there. But sometimes I get there. You get in this like state, and man, that's like nirvana. I love that state. I love getting off and being like, woo, you could like feel it. There's a euphoric feel in there. And it's sort of a third eye thing of like, you're still following your directions. You're still not endangering your other actors. You still are finding your light. You're still saying your lines, but you feel like you're in it in a way that's really unique. I love that. That is kind of the goal. I've never felt that on camera. I haven't had the opportunity. I haven't had the role meaty enough on camera to even fully get near that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that may lead us to our final question. One thing you want to accomplish as an actor that you haven't yet, and that could be something you want to get better at, tick off your theatrical wish list, or something else.
I want to play the types of roles I've played on stage. I want to have that opportunity on camera. Early on in an actor's career, I think for 99% of us, early on in an actor's career, when we're working with on camera, we all play the same types of roles, these co-stars and guest stars. We get there, we stand on our X, we say our lines, we provide a service to the show. We provide information or detail or context for the leads to respond to. And if that's on network television and a procedural, there's only a limit to what it is. It's those amazing independent films or those amazing, even studio films that are fantastic, sort of like high quality pictures. But those times, it's just celebrities that are getting those opportunities, right? The Viola Davises and the Denzels and the Tom Hanks and the Meryl Streeps of the world. So it's actually extremely rare air to be able to play meaty roles in good quality work on camera. I mean, if you think about it, every year, maybe like 20 people get to do it. And if you think about it, those 20 people, 17 of them have an Oscar already. Do you know what I mean?
I was going to say those 20 people don't change.
Yes. So it's like, yes, it's so for me, that is my, that's my dream. My dream isn't fame. My dream isn't the Malibu mansion. My dream is to be able to fulfill that. I want to share that work. I want to like play some of the great roles I've had a chance to play on stage on camera.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, it's nice to get to know you better.
I want to say to you, like, I talk to a lot of students that come out of training programs all over the country, from the ones that we all know, the NYUs and the Juilliards and the Carnegie Mellons, but also ones who went to small theater schools in liberal arts institutions in rural America, right? They all kind of say the same thing. Is like, we didn't really learn a lot about the industry. We didn't really like get a lot. We learned about the craft, but we didn't learn a lot about life as an actor. And so I think that this series that you're doing, especially for the students to hear, is great, because hearing from people is a key in to sort of that number one complaint I hear is I didn't learn a lot about life as an actor. Well, if you watch these 20 videos, you'll learn a lot about life as an actor. So I think that's pretty cool that you're doing this series.
Well, that's really nice of you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks for joining me.
Yeah, of course.
This has been An Actor's Arc. Created and hosted by me, Sean Douglas. With special guest, Behzad Dabu. Theme music by Chris Kriz. Sound engineering by Grover Hallway. An Actor's Arc, Season 2, was made possible by a grant from the alumni of Northwestern University.